There's nothing like a war to bring out the experts on war, or as I call them, the geniuses for war. On this day where President Obama is supposed to talk to the nation about possibly attacking Syria because of Syria's use of chemical weapons, I thought it might be interesting to discuss this and to go into the Corbett Test and see how Syria stacks up. Begin by showing you a picture of Albert Einstein. I used a quote of Einstein's prominently in my book. Einstein's definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I think that applies to not only what we've done in the recent past with regard to use of armed force, but also in the possibility of using it in Syria. As you know, President Obama created a red line which the Syrians have crossed, and now in order to save his pride, he needs to go and do something about it. And he sent out some experts, John Kerry, Secretary of State. He's been in the news prominently, not so prominently as Chuck Hagel, but Chuck, the Secretary of Defense, has come up with his own ideas of why we should be going to war. And of course, they're all supported by Martin Dempsey, General Martin Dempsey, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who really doesn't know why we're doing this or how we would do it. And he's been supported by comments from David Petraeus, the paragon of wisdom and good judgment, who says this is necessary that we go into Syria and do something bad to them. And then, of course, the usual suspects, John McCain, who became an expert in the war, sitting in a cell in North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and Lindsey Graham, who's a Air Force Reserve judge, advocate, general lawyer in the Air Force, and he's an expert on war too, supposedly. By now you probably have a pretty good idea what our self-appointed geniuses for war have to say about Syria. Now let's look at what a true genius for war, Julian Corbett, and see what he might think about the attack on Syria, or potential attack on Syria. Here's the Corbett Test, and I think it's pretty safe to say that the constants are pretty well taken care of. The United States hasn't changed. We pretty much have command of the seas in the Mediterranean, although that could be mixed up a little bit if the Russians or someone we aren't friendly with sends a submarine or two into the Mediterranean. Syria is remote. They don't have command of the seas, and they are connected to the sea, but they are sea-girt. Where we get into some problems, though, is on the United States side, is what's our objective? None of our geniuses for war have been able to clearly define what we're attempting to do and why we're attempting to do it. The other thing is popular repugnance. Today, roughly, the polls show about 80% of Americans are not in favor of going to war or using any type of military force in Syria. So I guess they haven't generated, this incident with the chemical weapons hasn't generated the sufficient level of repugnance in the American people to warrant using armed force in Syria. So let's look at Syria. Again, is it a limited object? What are we doing? It's still a big question mark. Certainly the use of chemical weapons is an antagonistic behavior, but it's not clear that for sure that the Syrian government was responsible for the use of chemical weapons. It is within the possibility that deception is being used here in order to draw the United States into something that would be ill-advised. The last thing is strategic isolation. That's the big stumbling point that we've seen in all previous applications of the Corbett Test, is that we don't have strategic isolation of Syria. It's not possible, and in order to succeed, we have to consider any armed engagement to be unlimited because of the possibility of Iran or any of the other groups such as Hezbollah entering into engagement against the United States directly, or perhaps against Israel or other Arab states in the region. It's an unknown. Certainly, though, strategic isolation of Syria is no longer possible because we don't have anyone in Iraq right now, and Iraq has to be assumed as being unfriendly to us. I'd like to conclude by just tying a few loose ends. One has to do with the word necessary that General Petraeus used the other day. This implies that this is a war of necessity as opposed to a war of choice. I think any objective observer of this situation recognizes that this is not a war of necessity for the United States. Second thing is unintended consequences. Many of you can go back to when we first went into Iraq, and geniuses for war at the time in high government positions were saying that we were going to be greeted with open arms by the Iraqi people as liberators. Well, that didn't work out so well. It took us almost 10 years, and what did it get us? We were not invited to stay in Iraq in any meaningful way other than a very large embassy. And we cannot consider Iraq as a reliable ally at this point, as you might expect if we had liberated them as some of us thought it was going to be. And more recently, we've got the case, lessons learned of Libya. We had the intentions of going into Libya, of deposing the dictator Muammar Gaddafi, and we succeeded. But what's happened in Libya since then is largely chaos. It's so chaotic. This is roughly 1 year and 1 day from the Benghazi attacks on our consulate there and the murder of our ambassador to Libya, is that we still don't know who our friends are in Libya, and it's a mess. And it brings us to the final lesson, and this is kind of a rule of foreign affairs, is that very often we're faced with a dilemma where there is no good choice. In Syria, we're faced with a choice of dealing with a dictator or dealing with an unknown of what comes after this dictator if we succeed in deposing that dictator, as we did in Libya. Our track record is not very good. And so I think it is in our best interest to stay out in a military sense and to pursue our best options in solving this admitted dilemma of no good choices.